Hi everyone, welcome to this video where today we're going to be looking at the fetch execute cycle and the stored program concept. Now this topic comes up in both GCSE and A-level computer science for AQA, so we're going to look at it in detail for both specifications, for both the GCSE and for the A-level. So first of all, we need to look at this term, the stored program concept. Now, early computers such as the IBM, so this is, if we get the pen out, looking at these big old machines. Now, there wasn't such thing as RAM or a hard drive back in the 1960s. Everything was stored on these punch cards. Now, the punch cards would have holes in them to indicate which bits to basically load as data, so instructions, data, would be held on this little card, and that would be fed into the IBM. So these computers essentially had the same amount of power as a kitchen toaster, but nonetheless they were just as powerful to calculate trajectories and getting astronauts to and back from the moon. Now, the stored program concept is an architecture, and it was introduced by John von Neumann, or von Neumann. This is an architecture you will need to know for your exam, and it's shown here. Now, essentially, the von Neumann architecture is the stored program concept, because you've got main memory, and the data and instructions from the main memory are loaded into the processor. So, for example, we might have data that moves into the processor and is carried out. So once that is done, and we've got the main memory data moved into the processor, we might need an address. So we look for the address, and this is loaded into processor. So essentially you have the data moving between the main memory and the processor. And if you Google von Neumann architecture, what you get is a picture where you've got the input. The input goes to essentially a square, and then obviously you get an output, but it's separate, where you have the CPU here, which is what we're looking at, and you've got your memory or your RAM here, and it's communicating with it. So that's essentially the von Neumann architecture. And if you're asked about the stored program concept, the best way to define it is data being stored in a memory location and moved into the processor. And if you're looking at what bus, this is moved between the processor and the main memory using the data bus. So how does a processor exactly execute the instructions? Well, a processor will execute instructions using the fetch execute cycle, and that's a key term that we need to take away from today's video. Now, it's a cycle of processes where the data is loaded into the processor from memory and its instructions are decoded and carried out. So the instructions loaded by the processor would either be machine code, binary, or assembly language mnemonics. So this algorithm below, what it does is, for A-level, you'll need to know assembly language and sort of writing in it, and you'll get the instruction set from AQA. But what we have here is a set of instructions. So, for example, here, we're loading memory address 101 and we're storing it in register 1. Similarly, we're loading memory address 102 and storing it in the second register. Then we're doing a comparison, where these two are compared with each other. And then if they're equal, we're going to branch to this block of code here. Otherwise, we're just going to move 1 into register 3, but if they're equal, we're going to move 0 into register 3. Now, just as a bit of a tangent on the side, this program, I think it's quite obvious to look at it as a comparison, where if the numbers are equal, we have a positive result, well, neutral result. Otherwise, we would have a positive result, which would indicate that they're not equal. So in essence, we should really turn this into BNE. But either way, this is very significant for the stored program concept and looking at our fetch execute cycle, because the instructions are split into opcodes and operands. So if I switch to a highlighter, opcodes are defined by the first half of the instruction. So the first half, it's what we're actually doing with the data. So this bit of data here, we're storing it. Whereas on this part of the opcode, let's go for blue, part of the instruction rather, we're defining the operand. So this is the data that we're using with the instructions. So here, the data we're using is the first register and memory address 101. So assembly language reflects the idea that we have opcodes and operands, and with regards to the fetch execute cycle, you'll see what I mean when I get into it. But first of all, we need to look at the registers that are used by a processor. So if you get a sort of cross-section of what a processor looks like on the inside, you get these many components, but the ones you need to know about are the registers. So a register is a super fast working memory within the processor. Now, one key thing you need to make sure is that you state this is within the processor, because another type of super fast memory is cache. So you need to indicate that you know that registers are within the processor. Otherwise, you could be confusing this with cache, which is another type of superfast memory. So the registers you need to know about are the program counter. So this keeps track of the next instruction for the processor to execute. The current instruction register uses the instructions that the processor are currently executing. So whatever's happening, this is in the current instruction register. The MAR, or the memory address register, stores the address of the data that's currently being executed. And similar to the CIR, the MBR is a buffer register. Now, the buffer refers to how it temporarily stores data being transferred between the computer processor and the main memory. So make sure you know these key terms, because these will be very useful for when we describe the fetch execute cycle, which without further ado we will get into. So for a GCSE level of detail, you essentially need to remember the facts that the next instruction is fetched to the CPU from the main memory, the instruction is decoded and carried out. So the address of the next instruction is held in the program counter, so the control unit looks to this address. The program counter will then increment by 1, so we know that we're pointing to the next instruction, and the contents of the address are copied into the CIR. So the CIR holds what we're using, it needs to be decoded, so whatever's at this address, we're going to move it into the CIR. Now the instruction is then decoded, so we determine what we're actually doing, and subsequently any information that we need that's extra, we'll fetch it from the main memory. And then after that we carry out the instruction by the processor's arithmetic logic unit. So for GCSE level of detail, this is what you need to know. However, if we're looking for an A-level sort of set of detail, this was an exam question on the specimen paper, and looking at the mark scheme, what they've said they're sort of expecting you to know is that first of all, the contents of the program counter are transferred to the MAR along the address bus. The program counter is then incremented by 1 to point to the next instruction. The contents of the address location in MAR is then moved to the MBR, and the MBR contents are then copied into the CIR. So that's the fetch part of the cycle. With regards to the decode, we're saying that the instruction held by the CIR is then decoded by the control unit, and that the instructions are then split into opcodes and operands, and this is where we need that level of detail so that you understand these assembly code or machine code instructions. Because they have a one-to-one correspondence with each other, we can reference them because they both have opcodes such as store, move, add, and operands, which is the data that they're using. So we need to be able to say that instructions split, and if necessary, the data that's extra is fetched from the CPU. Oh, that's odd. From the main memory. Bit of a typo there. So then the instruction is executed by the processor, and its results are stored in the accumulator. So for an A-level type of response, this is what you'd need. So thanks for watching, and I hope you join for the next video.